The fog comes in from the Pacific before dawn, slow and deliberate, wrapping the Santa Lucia Mountains in a silence so complete that the only sound is the moisture settling on stone. In the early hours of a winter morning in 1941, La Cuesta Encantada, the enchanted hill, emerges from darkness like a fever dream made solid. Towers of pale concrete rise above the mist, their Spanish colonial spires catching the first gray light. Below them, terraces descend in careful geometry, lined with citrus trees and Italian statuary, their leaves still wet from the night. Somewhere in the main house, a fire crackles in one of 18 fireplaces, its warmth battling the mountain chill that seeps through walls built to look ancient but engineered for a new century. The estate is quiet now, but in a few hours, trucks will grind up the 5-mile road from the coast, carrying food, fuel, and building materials for another day of construction on a project that began 22 years ago and shows no sign of ending. Somewhere in a guest room decorated with 16th-century Spanish choir stalls and medieval tapestries, worth more than most American homes, a famous actress sleeps beside a man whose name appears on 28 newspapers and whose debts, though hidden from the public, have grown so enormous that accountants in New York are beginning to wonder if even his empire can sustain them. The beauty of this place is undeniable, but so is the cost. And on this morning, as on every morning for nearly a quarter century, that cost is still being calculated. William Randolph Hearst called this place his ranch. The word was characteristic of his talent for understatement when it served him, for making the extraordinary seem casual. In reality, what rose on this remote California promontory was something unprecedented in American history, a private estate of such scale and ambition that it defied easy categorization. It was not quite a castle in the European sense, though it borrowed liberally from Spanish cathedrals and Moorish palaces. It was not a museum, though it housed one of the world's great private art collections. It was not a hotel, though it entertained Hollywood royalty and world leaders with a hospitality that rivaled the finest resorts. It was, in the end, exactly what its creator intended, a physical manifestation of one man's vision of what life should be, a monument to appetite that could never be satisfied, and a lesson in what happens when ambition refuses to recognize its own limits. The numbers alone stagger the imagination. The main house, known as Casa Grande, contains 68,500 square feet of interior space, making it larger than most European palaces. Its twin towers rise 137 feet above the hilltop, visible from miles away to ships passing along the coast. The estate encompasses 127 acres of formal gardens, terraces, and walkways, all requiring constant attention from a small army of gardeners. Within those grounds sit 3 guest houses, each one larger and more opulent than the mansions of most wealthy Americans. Casa del Mar, the largest, contains 18 rooms. Casa del Sol contains another 18. Casa del Monte, the smallest, has 10. Together with Casa Grande, the structures contain a total of 165 rooms, including 38 bedrooms and 42 bathrooms. 2 swimming pools, 1 outdoor, 1 indoor, required a combined 550,000 gallons of water to fill. The Neptune pool alone, an outdoor masterpiece of white Vermont marble surrounded by Roman colonnades, held 345,000 gallons and was built, demolished, and rebuilt 3 times before Hearst was satisfied with its appearance. The indoor Roman pool, lined with blue and gold Venetian glass tiles and designed to evoke an ancient Roman bath, contained another 205,000 gallons and required more than a decade to complete. Every tile in that pool was handmade and hand-set, one by craftsmen working from designs that mixed Greco-Roman patterns with Art Deco sensibilities in a combination that existed nowhere else on Earth. To stand in the main entrance of Casa Grande is to experience the full weight of Hearst's intention. The space soars upward into a coffered ceiling imported from a Spanish monastery, its dark wood and gold leaf absorbing the light from wrought iron chandeliers. The walls are hung with 16th-century Flemish tapestries depicting scenes from court life, their colors still vivid after 400 years. A massive refectory table, purchased from a demolished Italian palazzo, dominates the center of the room, surrounded by choir stalls carved by craftsmen who died before Columbus reached the New World. Every surface carries history, not the history of California, not the history of America, but the history of European aristocracy, compressed and rearranged and transplanted to a hilltop that had been, just decades earlier, nothing but grazing land for cattle. The effect is overwhelming, and that was precisely the point. Hearst did not build this place to be comfortable. He built it to be astonishing. He wanted his guests to walk through those doors and understand, immediately and viscerally, that they had entered the domain of a man who could acquire anything he desired and arrange it according to his whim. The medieval ceiling, the Renaissance fireplace, the Baroque statuary flanking the windows, none of these things belong together by any conventional standard of design. But they belonged to Hearst, and that was enough. Yet for all its visible grandeur, the true achievement of Hearst Castle lay in what visitors could not see. The system was engineered by Julia Morgan, Hearst's architect, with the same care she applied to every aspect of the project, but it required constant monitoring. Springs could slow in dry years, pipes could crack in earthquakes. The pumps that moved water from the reservoir to the highest points of the estate ran on electricity generated by the property's own power plant, a facility hidden in a canyon below the hilltop where diesel generators hummed around the clock. Later, the estate was connected to the regional electrical grid, but the generators remained as backup, a necessity in a location where storms could knock out power for days at a time. Heating came from a network of steam radiators fed by massive boilers in the basement of Casa Grande, burning fuel oil that had to be trucked up the mountain and stored in tanks buried beneath the grounds. The cold storage facilities where meat and produce were kept occupied thousands of square feet below the kitchens, humming with refrigeration equipment that represented the cutting edge of technology in the 1920s, but required specialized maintenance that local technicians could not provide. And then there was the staff. At the peak of Hearst's residency, between 60 and 80 people worked full-time on the estate, not counting the construction crews that continued their work throughout the 20s and 30s and into the 40s. There were cooks and sous chefs and kitchen assistants to feed the guests. There were housekeepers and maids to clean the rooms, butlers and footmen to serve the meals, laundresses to wash the linens, gardeners to tend the grounds. There were zookeepers to care for the exotic animals. At one point, the estate housed the largest private zoo in the world, with lions, tigers, leopards, bears, elephants, zebras, giraffes, and dozens of other species grazing on land visible from the terraces where guests sipped cocktails before dinner. There were mechanics for the fleet of vehicles, electricians for the generators, plumbers for the water system, carpenters and painters for the never-ending repairs that a structure of this complexity demanded. There were secretaries to handle Hearst's correspondence, telephone operators to manage the private switchboard, projectionists to run the movies that played every night in the estate's private theater. And overseeing it all was a household manager whose job was nothing less than running a small city, a city that existed for the comfort of one man and his guests, that operated according to his whims and schedules, and that could be thrown into chaos by a single telegram announcing that he was arriving early or late, or with twice as many guests as expected. The man who commanded this empire was, by any measure, one of the most powerful figures in American life during the first half of the 20th century. William Randolph Hearst was born in 1863, the only child of George Hearst, a prosperous mining engineer who would become one of the wealthiest men in California, and Phoebe Apperson Hearst, a school teacher who devoted herself to philanthropy and culture with an intensity that shaped her son's character. George was rough, practical, a man who had made his fortune digging silver and gold from the earth. Phoebe was refined, educated, determined that her son would have every advantage that culture could provide. Together they gave William Randolph a childhood that combined wild Western freedom, summers on the family's vast ranches where he learned to ride and shoot and roam without supervision, with exposure to the greatest art and architecture of Europe, which Phoebe showed him on extended tours when he was still a boy. It was on one of those trips when William was 10 years old that he first saw the things that would obsess him for the rest of his life. His mother took him to the great cathedrals of England and France, to the palazzos of Florence and Venice, to the castles of Spain and the museums of Germany. He saw tapestries woven for kings, paintings commissioned by popes, furniture that had belonged to emperors, and something awakened in him, a hunger for beautiful things, for rare things, for things that carried the weight of history. It was not merely an aesthetic appreciation, it was something closer to possession. He wanted to own what he saw. He wanted to gather it around him, and for the rest of his life, he never stopped. At 23, he convinced his father to give him control of the San Francisco Examiner, a failing newspaper that George Hearst had acquired as payment for a debt. Within a few years, the young publisher had transformed it into one of the most successful papers on the West Coast, pioneering a style of journalism that emphasized sensation, scandal, and emotional manipulation. He understood intuitively that newspapers were not primarily vehicles for information. They were vehicles for feelings, for outrage, for sympathy, for fear, for excitement. He gave his readers crime stories and crusades, exposés of corruption, and tales of human interest that tugged at the heartstrings. He spent lavishly on talent, hiring the best writers and artists he could find. He invested in the latest printing technology, producing papers with bold illustrations and striking layouts that stood out on the newsstands. And he expanded relentlessly, acquiring papers in New York, Chicago, Boston, Los Angeles, and eventually 24 other cities, building an empire that made him one of the most influential voices in American politics. The fortune this generated was staggering. By the 1920s, Hearst's income exceeded $15 million per year, the equivalent of several hundred million in today's money. He owned newspapers, magazines, radio stations, news services, and a film production company. He owned mines, ranches, and real estate across the country. And he spent almost as fast as he earned, buying art and antiquities with an abandon that horrified his financial advisors. His agents scoured Europe and the Middle East, purchasing entire castle interiors, monastery ceilings, choir stalls, altarpieces, tapestries, paintings, sculptures, armor, furniture, and decorative objects by the trainload. Warehouses in New York and San Francisco overflowed with crates that had never been opened, purchases so numerous that Hearst himself could not remember everything he owned. By one estimate, he spent approximately $1 million per year on art for nearly 3 decades, a total of perhaps $30 million, at a time when a skilled worker earned a few $1,000s annually. It was collecting as compulsion, acquisition as addiction, and all of it was destined eventually for the hilltop in California, where he would build a setting worthy of his possessions. He first visited the site as a boy, camping with his father on the family's vast San Simeon ranch, which stretched for miles along the coast. The hilltop he called Camp Hill was a favorite spot. The views were spectacular, the air was clean, and the isolation appealed to his sense of romance. Decades later, after his mother died in 1919 and he inherited the property outright, Hearst wrote to Julia Morgan with a request that would consume the next 28 years of both their lives. He wanted to build something permanent on Camp Hill, something beautiful, something that would last. Julia Morgan was, in many ways, an unlikely partner for one of America's most famous egomaniacs. She was modest, practical, soft-spoken, and utterly lacking in pretension. She dressed plainly, lived simply, and avoided the spotlight with a determination that bordered on phobia. She was also, without question, one of the most accomplished architects in America. The first woman to earn a certificate from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the first woman licensed to practice architecture in California, she had designed over 700 buildings by the time of her death, ranging from small private homes to churches, stores, hospitals, and the Hearst mining building at the University of California, Berkeley, which she designed for Phoebe Hearst. She was meticulous, detail-oriented, and possessed of an engineering mind that could solve problems most architects never even recognized. She was also, crucially, patient enough to work with a client who changed his mind constantly, who demanded revisions on a weekly basis, who would tear down finished structures because he had thought of something better. For nearly 3 decades, Morgan traveled to San Simeon almost every weekend, meeting with Hearst to discuss progress and plans, reviewing blueprints and samples, managing the hundreds of workers who labored on the hill. She answered his telegrams, sometimes dozens per week, with careful, measured responses. She accommodated his whims without complaint, and she produced, in the end, one of the most remarkable buildings in America. Construction began in earnest in 1920, with work on the 3 guest houses and the first section of Casa Grande. From the beginning, the project was defined by its contradictions. Hearst wanted a building that looked ancient, weathered, rooted in centuries of tradition. But he also wanted modern conveniences, electricity, plumbing, central heating, telephones, elevators. He wanted to use antique materials wherever possible. Old tiles, old ceilings, old columns salvaged from demolished European structures. But he also needed modern concrete and steel to support the weight and withstand the earthquakes that shook California with unsettling regularity. Morgan's genius lay in her ability to reconcile these demands, to create buildings that appeared to have stood for centuries while incorporating structural innovations invisible to the untrained eye. The walls of Casa Grande were reinforced concrete, poured in place and faced with stone, carved to look like ancient masonry. The roof was supported by steel beams hidden behind wooden ceilings brought from Spain. The floors concealed networks of wiring and piping that would have seemed miraculous to the medieval craftsmen whose work adorned the rooms above. The logistics of construction were nightmarish. The road up the mountain was narrow, steep, and treacherous. Heavy trucks wore out their brakes on the descent and their engines on the climb. Materials that could not be trucked, particularly the massive architectural elements Hearst purchased from Europe, had to be brought by ship to the private pier at San Simeon, then loaded onto wagons and hauled up the hill by teams of horses, or later by tractors. Some pieces were so large that they required special roads to be cut into the mountainside, roads that were used once and then allowed to grow over. Some pieces arrived damaged and had to be repaired on site by craftsmen who specialized in restoration work. Some pieces arrived only to discover that they did not fit the spaces intended for them, requiring Morgan to redesign entire rooms around objects that Hearst had purchased on impulse without providing accurate measurements. The workforce fluctuated with the seasons and with Hearst's finances, ranging from a few dozen at the low points to several hundred during periods of intensive construction. Many of the skilled craftsmen were immigrants, Italians who specialized in tile work and plaster work, Spaniards who knew how to work with the traditional materials that Hearst favored, Germans and Scandinavians who brought expertise in carpentry and metalwork. They lived in a camp on the hillside, rising early and working long hours in conditions that could be brutally hot in summer and bone-chillingly cold in winter. They were paid well by the standards of the time, but the isolation and difficulty of the work took a toll. Turnover was constant. Morgan spent considerable energy recruiting replacements, maintaining relationships with trade unions and training programs, and ensuring that the specialized skills the project required would not be lost when key workers departed. Time meant something different on this project than it did on ordinary construction jobs. There was no fixed completion date, no moment when the work would be declared finished. Hearst treated his castle the way other men treat gardens, as a living thing to be cultivated, adjusted, improved, never quite perfected. Rooms were built, furnished, lived in, and then torn apart because Hearst decided he wanted the walls 3 feet farther back, or the ceiling 6 inches higher, or the windows facing a different direction. The Neptune pool, that iconic symbol of the estate's grandeur, was constructed 3 times. The first version, completed in the early 20s, was a simple oval basin. Hearst found it unimpressive. Morgan designed a larger version, rectangular, with a classical temple at one end. Hearst approved, then changed his mind about the dimensions. The pool was demolished and rebuilt to the new specifications. And then, years later, Hearst decided he wanted it larger still, with colonnades flanking the sides and a cascade of marble steps descending to the water. The third version, the one that survives today, was not completed until 1936, 16 years after construction began. The cost was astronomical. But cost for Hearst was never the decisive factor. Only perfection mattered, or at least the endless pursuit of perfection. For the guests who arrived at this improbable paradise, the experience was carefully orchestrated to produce a specific effect. They came by car or by train to the small station at San Luis Obispo, where Hearst's drivers waited with limousines to transport them the remaining 40 miles to the coast and then up the mountain road. As they climbed, the landscape grew wilder, the Pacific falling away behind them, the scrubby hills rising on either side. Just when the journey seemed interminable, the road crested a final ridge, and the castle appeared, impossibly grand, impossibly white, impossibly there, as if a Spanish cathedral had been transported whole from Seville and reassembled on a California mountaintop. Guests were shown to their rooms, each one decorated with genuine antiques, each one equipped with a private bathroom, a luxury that many European palaces still lacked, each one offering views over the terraced gardens to the shimmering Pacific below. They were informed of the house rules. Dinner was served at 9 in the main refectory, no excuses accepted. Alcohol was limited. Hearst despised drunkenness, though he did not prohibit drinking entirely. Guests were expected to entertain themselves during the day, enjoying the pools, the tennis courts, the riding trails, the zoo. And guests were never, under any circumstances, to discuss the cost of anything they saw. The guest list read like a who's who of early 20th century celebrity. Charlie Chaplin swam in the Neptune pool. Winston Churchill admired the views from the terrace. Greta Garbo walked the gardens in the early morning mist. Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, and Franklin Roosevelt all visited as presidential candidates or sitting presidents. Aviators, explorers, writers, painters, composers, titans of industry, and foreign dignitaries mingled in the refectory beneath the medieval ceiling, eating off antique plates served by footmen in formal livery, while ketchup and mustard bottles sat in the center of the table because Hearst, for all his sophistication, retained the tastes of a frontier boy who liked condiments with his steaks. The contradictions were endless, and they were part of the charm. This was not a stuffy aristocratic residence. It was a playground built by a man who had never quite outgrown his love of play. And always, at the center of it all, was the woman who was Hearst's companion for more than 3 decades. Marion Davies was a former showgirl and film actress when she met Hearst in 1917. She was 20 years old. He was 54. He was married, with 5 sons, and he would remain married until his death. His wife, Millicent, refused to grant a divorce, and the Catholic beliefs of both parties complicated matters further. But from the moment he met Marion, Hearst's life revolved around her. He founded a film production company largely to produce her movies. He promoted her relentlessly in his newspapers. He built the castle, in large part, as a stage for her to perform her role as hostess, entertaining Hollywood royalty in a setting that made even the most extravagant Beverly Hills mansion look modest. Marion was beautiful, funny, warm, and genuinely kind, qualities that endeared her to nearly everyone who met her, even those who might have been inclined to judge her relationship with a married man. She was also, by all accounts, a talented comedian whose career was damaged by Hearst's insistence on casting her in serious, dramatic roles that did not suit her gifts. But she adored him, and he adored her, and together they presided over their mountain kingdom with a hospitality that became legendary. Yet beneath the glamour, the finances of Hearst's empire were growing increasingly precarious. The pattern of his spending had always been unsustainable. He earned enormous sums, but he spent even more, assuming that his income would continue to rise indefinitely. The Great Depression shattered that assumption. Newspaper revenues fell as advertising dried up. The value of his real estate holdings collapsed. His art collection, which he had assumed could be liquidated in an emergency, proved almost impossible to sell in a market where even wealthy buyers were hoarding cash. By the mid-1930s, Hearst's debts had grown so large that his bankers forced him to accept a restructuring that stripped him of direct control over his own company. A team of accountants and executives, brought in by the lenders, began the painful process of cutting costs and selling assets. Newspapers were closed or merged, magazines were shut down, properties were sold, including the legendary Clarendon Apartments in New York, where Hearst had kept one of his several residences. And most painfully of all, the art collection began to be dispersed. Entire warehouses full of crated treasures were sold at auction, some at prices far below what Hearst had paid, some in bulk lots that bundled masterpieces with trinkets. The man who had spent a lifetime gathering beauty was forced to watch it slip away. At San Simeon, the impact was felt almost immediately. Construction slowed, then nearly stopped. The workforce that had numbered in the hundreds dwindled to a skeleton crew. Projects that had been planned for years were postponed indefinitely. Some were never completed. To walk through Hearst Castle today is to see, if you know where to look, the scars of this financial crisis. Rooms that were finished on only one side, ceilings that were meant to receive elaborate painting but never did, spaces that were left as bare concrete because the money ran out before they could be transformed. The vast ambition that had driven the project from the beginning had finally collided with the limits of even Hearst's resources. The machine of acquisition had consumed its own fuel. Marion Davies, in what may have been the most moving gesture of their relationship, sold her jewelry to help Hearst meet his obligations. She gave him over $1 million, her own money, earned through her film career, at a moment when his pride made it almost impossible for him to accept help. He cried when he learned what she had done. It was, by all accounts, one of the only times his guests ever saw him weep. The Second World War brought new challenges and, paradoxically, a measure of relief. The wartime economy revived Hearst's newspaper revenues as factories producing armaments bought advertising space and workers with good wages sought entertainment and information. But travel restrictions meant that the elaborate house parties of the 20s and 30s became impossible. Gasoline rationing limited the number of guests who could drive up the mountain. The staff was reduced as workers left for military service or war industry jobs. The exotic animals of the zoo, which had always been expensive to feed and care for, were gradually dispersed to zoos around the country, a process that had begun during the Depression but accelerated during the war years. By 1945, when the conflict ended, Hearst Castle had become a quieter, smaller, more melancholy place than it had been a decade earlier. The parties continued, but on a reduced scale. The construction continued, but fitfully. And Hearst himself, now in his early 80s, was beginning to feel his age. His health had never been robust. He had suffered from heart problems for years, and by the mid-40s, his doctors were warning him that the altitude of San Simeon was putting dangerous strain on his cardiovascular system. In 1947, the doctors insisted that he leave the hilltop permanently. It was not advice, it was an ultimatum. If he stayed at San Simeon, they told him, he would die there. And so, one afternoon in the spring of that year, William Randolph Hearst was carried down the mountain for the last time. He settled in a house in Beverly Hills that Marion had purchased years earlier, a house that was comfortable and convenient, but that lacked the grandeur, the views, and the sense of dominion that the castle had provided. He never returned to Camp Hill. He never saw his creation again. He spent his final years in declining health, still issuing directives for his newspapers by telephone and telegram, still dreaming of projects that would never be completed. He died on August 14, 1951, at the age of 88. Marion Davies, the companion of more than 30 years, was not permitted to attend his funeral. The Hearst family, which had tolerated her presence while the old man lived, closed ranks after his death. She learned he was gone only from the radio. The castle sat empty for years afterward, a monument without a purpose. The Hearst Corporation, which controlled the property, had no use for it. The costs of maintaining the buildings and grounds remained substantial, even with minimal staff. Proposals to sell the estate came to nothing. Who would buy such a place, and for what purpose? Finally, in 1957, the Hearst family reached an agreement with the state of California. The Hilltop estate, with all its buildings, gardens, and art collections, would be donated to the state as a public monument. The family retained ownership of the surrounding ranch lands, which remain in private hands to this day. But the castle itself, La Cuesta Encantada, the enchanted hill, the dream made concrete, passed into public ownership to be preserved for future generations as a monument to one man's vision. The state opened the castle to tourists in 1958, and they have been coming ever since. In a typical year, More than 800,000 visitors make the journey up the coast from Los Angeles or down from San Francisco, turning off the highway at the little town of San Simeon, parking in the visitors center lot, and boarding buses for the 5-mile ride up the mountain. 4 different tours are offered, each one focusing on different aspects of the property. The main floors of Casa Grande, the upper floors and libraries, the gardens and pools, the kitchens and wine cellars. Guides lead groups of a dozen or more through rooms that Hearst once reserved for the most powerful and famous people in the world, explaining the provenance of the tapestries, the history of the ceilings, the engineering challenges that Morgan overcame. The visitors gaze at the Neptune pool and imagine what it must have been like to swim there on a summer evening, with the mountains turning purple in the distance and the lights of the castle glowing above. They photograph the zebras, the descendants of Hearst's original herd, which still roam the lower pastures, a living reminder of the zoo that once covered these hills. And then they board the buses and descend the mountain, returning to lives that could hardly be more different from the life that was lived here. But what those visitors rarely see, what the tours are not designed to reveal, is the vast machinery required to keep the castle standing and open to the public. The California Department of Parks and Recreation, which manages the property, employs dozens of full-time staff just for Hearst Castle alone. There are curators who oversee the art collection, conservators who clean and repair the tapestries and paintings, archivists who maintain records of the castle's history and construction. There are gardeners who tend the grounds, maintaining the same level of care that Hearst demanded, pruning the trees and hedges, replanting the flower beds, monitoring the irrigation systems that keep the gardens alive during California's increasingly severe droughts. There are maintenance workers who repair the roofs and walls, who service the plumbing and electrical systems, who keep the pools filled and chemically balanced. There are guides who lead the tours, ticket takers who manage the visitors, bus drivers who transport groups up and down the mountain, security guards who patrol the grounds at night. The costs are enormous. Operating Hearst Castle as a state park requires a budget of millions of dollars annually, funds that come partly from ticket sales and partly from California's general park budget, which is itself subject to the vagaries of state politics and economic conditions. In lean years, maintenance is deferred. Projects that should be undertaken are postponed. The slow deterioration that affects all historic structures accelerates. In prosperous years, conservation efforts expand. Major restoration projects are undertaken. The castle receives the care it needs to survive another generation. The pattern is one of constant negotiation between the ideal of perfect preservation and the reality of limited resources. Consider the Neptune pool. That magnificent basin of white marble, that dream of classical antiquity transplanted to the California coast, requires constant attention to remain in usable condition. The marble facade is subject to weathering. The tiles that line the pool's interior can crack from the expansion and contraction of freeze-thaw cycles, rare though hard freezes are at this elevation. The plumbing that fills and drains the pool, miles of pipe running beneath the surface, corrodes over time. The pumps and filters require regular maintenance. Simply keeping the pool clean, free of algae and debris, demands daily attention. And every few decades, a major restoration is necessary. Draining the pool, repairing the structure, replacing damaged elements, addressing problems that have accumulated over years of use. The most recent major restoration was completed in 2021, after years of work and an expenditure of more than $10 million. It was necessary. It was expensive. And in another few decades, it will need to be done again, The same pattern applies to every element of the castle. The roofs require regular inspection and repair. The stucco facades must be maintained. The antique wood of the ceilings and choir stalls must be protected from insects and humidity. The tapestries, some of them 500 years old, made of materials that were never intended to survive this long, must be monitored for light damage and fiber deterioration. The paintings require periodic cleaning and conservation. The furniture used by visitors on some tours shows where that must be addressed. The infrastructure that Hearst built, the electrical systems, the plumbing, the heating, has reached the end of its designed lifespan and must be replaced with modern equivalents that can be hidden within the historic fabric. Each project is a negotiation between preservation and functionality, between authenticity and sustainability. And looming over all of it is a threat that Hearst never anticipated: climate change. The California coast has always been subject to natural hazards: earthquakes, wildfires, droughts, landslides. But the frequency and intensity of these hazards are increasing as the climate shifts. Wildfires, in particular, have become a constant concern. The hills surrounding Hearst Castle are covered with the same dry vegetation that has fueled devastating fires throughout California in recent years. A fire that reached the hilltop would be catastrophic. The buildings, for all their apparent solidity, contain enormous amounts of combustible material. The wooden ceilings, the textile wall coverings, the thousands of books in the libraries, the furniture, the tapestries. A single spark in the wrong place could destroy in hours what took decades to build. The state has invested in fire breaks and vegetation management, but the risk cannot be eliminated entirely. Every autumn, as the Santa Ana winds blow and the fire season reaches its peak, the staff at Hearst Castle holds its breath, watching the horizon for smoke, hoping that this will not be the year when the enchantment ends. The economics of preservation are relentless. A property like Hearst Castle cannot sustain itself through admiration alone. It requires revenue, and that revenue comes primarily from visitors. But visitors themselves impose costs. Their feet wear down the floors. Their breath and body heat affect the humidity levels that determine how quickly organic materials deteriorate. Their presence requires staff, buses, facilities, insurance. The calculus is complex. More visitors mean more revenue, but they also mean more wear, more risk, more expense. Fewer visitors reduce the impact on the buildings, but they also reduce the income needed to maintain them. Finding the balance is a constant challenge, complicated by factors beyond anyone's control: economic recessions that reduce tourism, pandemics that close the park entirely, highway closures that cut off access to the coast. And yet, the castle endures. It has endured the death of its creator, the dispersal of his empire, the transfer to public ownership. It has endured earthquakes that shook the hilltop and storms that battered the coast. It has endured budget crises and management challenges and the slow erosion of time. It has endured because people, successive generations of curators and conservators and gardeners and guides and administrators, have made the decision again and again to do the work necessary to keep it standing. Not because it serves any practical purpose, not because it generates profits for its owners, but because it is beautiful, and because beauty, once created, makes a claim on those who encounter it. The claim is not absolute. It can be rejected. Many historic structures have been allowed to crumble because no one was willing to pay the cost of their preservation. But at Hearst Castle so far, the claim has been honored. The work has continued. The enchantment has been maintained. To understand what this really means, consider a single day in the life of the castle as a public monument. Before dawn, the first staff members arrive, security guards who have watched the property through the night, groundskeepers beginning their rounds before the heat of the day. The buses are inspected, the restrooms cleaned, the ticket booth prepared. By 8 o'clock, the first tours are departing, loaded with visitors who have traveled from around the world to see this place. As they wind up the mountain, guides rehearse their scripts, preparing to answer the same questions they have answered 1,000 times before. What was Hearst really like? How much did all this cost? Is it true that Orson Welles based Citizen Kane on Hearst's life? The answers are delivered with professional enthusiasm, concealing the weariness that comes from repetition. Meanwhile, in parts of the castle closed to the public, conservators are working on a 16th century tapestry that has developed a tear in its lower border. They work with tweezers and magnifying glasses, using thread that matches the original as closely as possible, repairing damage that is invisible to the casual observer, but that, left unaddressed, would eventually destroy the entire piece. In the basement of Casa Grande, a plumber is replacing a section of pipe that corroded through last winter. The work is difficult. The original plumbing was installed in the 1920s, and modern replacement parts do not always fit. But he finds a solution, improvising an adapter that will hold until a more permanent repair can be scheduled. In the garden, a team of workers is removing a tree that died during last summer's drought. The tree was planted in 1932. It has been part of the landscape for nearly a century. Now it is gone, and a new tree must be selected, purchased, transported, and planted to take its place. By evening, the last tour has descended the mountain, and the staff begins closing up for the night. Doors are locked. Alarms are set. The lights in the pools are turned off, leaving the water dark beneath the stars. Somewhere in the main house, a curator walks the rooms one final time, checking for anything out of place, anything that might signal a problem developing. The refectory, where Hearst once sat at the head of his table, surrounded by movie stars and politicians, is empty now. The ketchup bottles long since removed, the footmen long since departed. But the medieval ceiling is still there, and the tapestries, and the choir stalls, and the wrought iron chandelier that casts shadows on the walls just as it did 80 years ago. The room is waiting for something that will never come again. Another party, another gathering of the powerful and famous, another evening of conversation and laughter beneath the coffered beams. That era is over. It ended when Hearst was carried down the mountain, and it can never be restored. But the room remains, and so does the castle, and so does the memory of the man who built it, preserved in stone and tile and glass and wood, maintained by the labor of strangers who never knew him, visited by pilgrims who come to see what one man's ambition could create. The question that visitors ask most often, how much did all this cost, is, in one sense, unanswerable. The total expenditure on construction, art, maintenance, and operation over the life of the project has never been calculated precisely, and probably cannot be. The records are incomplete. The accounting practices of the era were different from today's. The value of goods and labor has shifted so dramatically over the past century that comparisons are almost meaningless. But estimates have been made. The construction itself, the buildings, the pools, the gardens, the infrastructure, probably cost somewhere between $30 and $40 million in the money of the 1920s through 1940s. The art and antiquities that filled the rooms were worth at least as much, possibly more. The operating expenses, staff salaries, utilities, maintenance, food, transportation, added millions more over the decades. Adjusted for inflation, the total investment in Hearst Castle may have exceeded $1 billion in today's terms. It was, by any measure, one of the most expensive private building projects in American history. But the deeper question is not how much it cost, but what it cost. Every dollar spent on Hearst Castle was a dollar not spent on something else. Every hour of labor that went into carving a cornice or laying a tile was an hour that could have been devoted to building hospitals or schools or affordable housing. Every ship that carried antiquities from Europe to California was a ship that could have carried grain or medicine or tools. This is not to say that the castle should not have been built. That judgment depends on values that are beyond the scope of any narration to determine. But it is to recognize that creation always involves trade-offs. The beauty of this place was purchased at a price, and the price was paid not only by Hearst, but by all the workers and craftsmen who devoted their lives to a project that served, ultimately, one man's vision of paradise. Whether that was a fair bargain, whether the world is richer or poorer for the existence of Hearst Castle, is a question that each visitor must answer for themselves. What is beyond dispute is that the castle reveals something essential about the nature of ambition. William Randolph Hearst was a man who could not stop. He could not stop acquiring newspapers, could not stop accumulating art, could not stop building and rebuilding his mountain retreat. Each achievement led not to satisfaction, but to new desire. Each completion was merely the beginning of the next project. The castle was never finished, because Hearst never intended it to be finished. Completion would have meant the end of the process, and the process was what he lived for. The rooms he built were not destinations but waypoints, places to pause before moving on to the next design, the next purchase, the next expansion. He was, in the deepest sense, a man without a stopping point, and that is both the source of the castle's grandeur and the tragedy at its heart. There is a room in Casa Grande called the Gothic Study, where Hearst worked when he was in residence. It is a small room by the standards of the house, modest, even intimate. The walls are lined with bookshelves. A fireplace provides warmth on cold evenings. The furniture is comfortable rather than imposing. Through the window, you can see the Pacific, miles away and thousands of feet below, glittering in the afternoon light. This was where Hearst sat, late at night, sending telegrams to his editors, reading reports from his properties around the world, planning the next addition to his collection. He was never idle. He was never content. Even in paradise, especially in paradise, he was always working, always scheming, always reaching for something just beyond his grasp. And when his health failed and he was forced to leave, there were still projects unfinished, still rooms left as bare concrete, still dreams that would never be realized. The enchantment, it turns out, was not in the having, but in the wanting. Once the wanting stopped, there was nothing left. Today, the castle stands as a monument to that wanting, a physical record of one man's refusal to accept limits. It is beautiful beyond question. It is also exhausting to contemplate this relentless accumulation, this endless expansion, this appetite that could never be satisfied. The guests who came here in the 20s and 30s reported feeling overwhelmed not just by the grandeur, but by the sheer quantity of things demanding attention. Every surface was covered with art. Every room was filled with furniture. Every view was designed to impress. There was no rest for the eyes, no space left empty, no corner left undecorated. It was not a home. It was a collection of collections, a museum pretending to be a residence, a stage set that happened to have plumbing. The comfort was real. The beds were excellent, the food superb, the service impeccable. But the peace of mind that a home is supposed to provide was elusive. How could one relax in a space that was constantly demanding admiration? And yet visitors return, year after year, drawn by the same qualities that made the original guests uneasy. They come to see what one man's ambition could achieve when freed from practical constraints. They come to measure their own dreams against the scale of Hearst's vision. They come perhaps to reassure themselves that they would not have made the same choices, that they would have known when to stop, would have recognized the point of sufficiency, would have been satisfied with less. Whether those reassurances are justified is another question. The appetite that drove Hearst is not unique to him. It is a human appetite, magnified by circumstance but not created by it. Given unlimited resources and unlimited ambition, many of us might build our own enchanted hills, our own monuments to wanting. Hearst simply had the means to do what others only dream about. His castle is not an aberration, it is an amplification. The lesson of Hearst Castle, if it has a lesson, is not that ambition is wrong. It is that ambition has costs, and those costs extend beyond the ambitious individual. The workers who built this place, the staff who maintained it, the accountants who struggled to pay for it, the family members who lived in its shadow, all of them paid prices that Hearst never fully acknowledged. His debts, when they finally came due, were borne by shareholders and employees who had no say in the spending decisions that created them. His art collection, dispersed in the crisis of the late 30s, was lost not just to him but to the world that might have benefited from seeing it assembled. His castle, transferred to public ownership because his heirs could not afford to maintain it, became a burden on California taxpayers who never asked to assume responsibility for a media tycoon's dream. Great creations do not exist in isolation. They are embedded in networks of obligation and consequence that their creators may prefer to ignore. The view from the mountaintop is magnificent, but the climb leaves its marks on everyone who makes it. In the end, what survives at Hearst Castle is not quite what Hearst intended. He imagined a private paradise, a place of escape and entertainment, a setting for the good life as he understood it. What exists now is a public monument, accessible to anyone willing to pay the price of admission, interpreted by guides who never knew the man who built it, maintained by workers who have no personal stake in its history. The parties are over. The guests are gone. The silence on the hilltop, in the early morning hours before the first tour buses arrive, is more complete than it ever was in Hearst's time. But the buildings remain, the art remains, the gardens remain, tended now not for the pleasure of one man, but for the education and enjoyment of hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. The castle has outlived its creator, as he perhaps knew it would, as he perhaps intended. Beauty, unlike the man who commanded its creation, does not age. Stone does not die. The tapestries may fade, the marble may weather, the wood may slowly decay. But carefully tended, protected, restored, these things endure. The enchantment continues, even if the enchanter is gone. And so the story of Hearst Castle becomes finally a story about stewardship. Who takes responsibility for the things that outlast their creators? Who decides what is worth preserving and at what cost, and for whose benefit? Who does the work of maintenance when the original vision has been fulfilled and only the upkeep remains? These are not romantic questions. They are practical questions, answered every day by the curators and conservators and administrators who keep the castle standing. The romance belongs to Hearst, to the vision, the ambition, the appetite that never stopped. The reality belongs to the people who come after, who inherit not the dream, but the structure, not the ambition, but the obligation. They are the ones who climb the scaffolding to repair the roofs, who kneel in the gardens to pull weeds, who spend their careers protecting textile fibers from invisible decay. They are not famous. Their names will not be remembered. But without them, the castle would crumble, and the enchantment would end, and future generations would have only photographs and stories to tell them what once stood on this California hilltop. Great beauty does not survive on admiration alone. It endures only through continuous effort, through compromise, through service. The castle that Hearst built to escape the ordinary world has become dependent on the most ordinary work imaginable: fixing, cleaning, maintaining, repairing. The man who despised limits has created a structure whose preservation demands limits of the most rigorous kind. The empire that was built on excess now survives through careful economy. The irony would not be lost on Hearst himself, who understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the world has a way of humbling those who seek to dominate it. He built his castle to last forever. Forever turns out to require a lot of maintenance. On a spring evening, when the fog is beginning to roll in from the Pacific and the lights of the castle are coming on one by one, a visitor might pause on the terrace and look out over the darkening land below. The hills descend to the sea, and the sea stretches to the horizon, and somewhere out there, invisible in the gathering mist, ships are passing, bound for ports around the world. William Randolph Hearst stood on this terrace many times, watching the same sunset, contemplating the same view. He owned everything he could see, and much that he could not see, and still he wanted more. That wanting built this castle, that wanting filled it with the treasures of Europe, that wanting kept the construction crews working for nearly 3 decades, rebuilding and expanding, never satisfied, never done. And now the wanting is over, and the castle remains, and the question that lingers is not whether it was worth building, but whether it is worth keeping, and if so, for whom, and for how long, and at what cost? The answer, for now, is yes. California has decided that Hearst Castle is worth keeping, worth maintaining, worth showing to the public. The state has made a commitment, and that commitment requires resources that could be used for other purposes. Whether that commitment will endure is impossible to say. Budgets change. Priorities shift. The political will to support cultural preservation waxes and wanes. Perhaps in some future decade, a legislature will decide that the cost of maintaining Hearst Castle exceeds its value, and the property will be sold or closed or allowed to deteriorate. Perhaps climate change will bring a fire that settles the matter once and for all. Perhaps earthquakes, which have shaken the hilltop many times already, will one day bring down the towers that took so long to build. Nothing lasts forever, not even the enchanted hill. But for now, the castle stands, and the tourists come, and the guides lead their groups through rooms that were designed to impress and that still impress nearly a century later. For now, the conservators do their work, and the gardeners tend the grounds, and the maintenance crews fix what needs fixing. For now, the enchantment endures, and that is perhaps the most honest conclusion that can be drawn. Not that the story is over, but that it continues day by day, tour by tour, repair by repair. Hearst's vision was of something permanent, something that would outlast him, something that would stand as a monument to his power and his taste. What he got was something more fragile and more beautiful, a living project, dependent on human care, sustained by human effort, renewed by each generation that chooses to carry the work forward. The castle is not a finished thing, it is a process, And as long as that process continues, the enchantment is real. The fog has come in fully now, wrapping the towers in white, muffling the sounds of the coast below. Somewhere in Casa Grande, a night guard walks the empty rooms, his footsteps echoing on marble floors. The tapestries hang in darkness, their colors invisible until morning. The Neptune pool lies still, its waters black beneath the overcast sky. The zebras, descendants of the original herd, are bedded down in the lower pastures, as their ancestors were bedded down when Hearst himself walked these grounds. And on the terraces and staircases and in the gardens, the statues stand as they have stood for decades, waiting for the dawn, waiting for the visitors, waiting for another day in the long life of a place that was built to last, and that, against all odds, is still lasting. This is Hearst Castle as it exists today, not a relic of the past, but an ongoing achievement, constantly threatened, constantly defended, constantly renewed. The enchantment continues, but it continues only because someone, every single day, makes the choice to sustain it. If you had the resources to build anything you could imagine, would you ever be able to recognize the moment when enough was finally enough? Or would the wanting, like Hearst's, simply never stop?